January 17, 1943, North Atlantic. The sea was black glass, broken by the slow rhythm of waves against a steel hull. Deep below, the German U-boat U-187 crept through freezing water, its engines humming low, its crew exhausted and silent. The captain leaned over the hydrophone operator's shoulder, straining to hear. Then it came, a sharp metallic pulse that cut through the noise of the ocean. Ping. Another. Closer. Ping. The sound crawled through steel and bone. Above them, somewhere beyond the darkness, a British destroyer swept the sea with a new kind of power. A weapon that hunted not by sight, but by sound. Inside the U-boat, tension rose like pressure in the hull. The crew waited for the first depth charges. But instead came something else. A brief silence, then a series of dull thuds, explosions not from behind but ahead. The destroyer had fired an unseen ring of contact bombs, Hedgehog, the first of its kind. The ocean had become a new kind of battlefield, and sound itself was now a weapon. In the years between the two world wars, the British Admiralty faced a haunting memory. The Shadow War of 1917, when German U-boats nearly starved an island nation into surrender. The convoys that saved Britain had been formed late, under desperate pressure, and though victory came, it came with scars. Those scars shaped everything that followed. When the guns fell silent in 1918, British naval thinkers understood one lesson above all. The next war would not be won solely by battleships or fleets. It would be won in the unseen depths. The enemy would come again from beneath the waves. That understanding led to a quiet revolution in naval science. In small workshops and laboratories around Portsmouth, Scottish engineers and physicists began experimenting with underwater sound. They discovered that pulses of sound could bounce off metal hulls and return echoes through the water. By 1924, this crude principle evolved into a military device known as ASDIC, the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee's new creation. It was the world's first operational sonar, designed to locate a submarine not by sight, but by reflected sound waves. To the Royal Navy, this seemed the ultimate answer to the U-boat menace. When war erupted again in September 1939, Britain entered the conflict with confidence in ASDIC. Destroyers and corvettes carried the distinctive domes beneath their bows, transmitting rhythmic pulses into the ocean. Operators listened for echoes, faint, delayed returns that betrayed a submarine's position. In theory, this gave the hunter a lethal edge. Yet as the first convoys crossed the Atlantic, the war at sea revealed a brutal truth. Technology alone could not save them. German U-boats, sleek and silent, hunted in packs. Their commander, Admiral Karl Dönitz, understood that Britain's survival depended on supply lines stretching from Canada and America across the Atlantic. If those lifelines could be cut, the British Isles would wither. His wolf packs, groups of coordinated submarines, struck under moonless skies, surfacing to attack convoys at night when ASDIC was useless. Between 1939 and 1941, merchant losses soared. Ships burned on the horizon, convoys scattered in panic, and the Royal Navy's escorts were stretched beyond their limits. The sea itself was treacherous to sound. Temperature layers bent sonar beams. Rough seas and fast-moving ships masked echoes. Even the hum of the destroyer's own propellers could drown the delicate pulse of ASDIC. For every submarine detected, many more slipped away unseen. Crews began to mistrust their instruments, relying instead on instinct, courage, and luck. The men who listened through headsets in sonar rooms learned to read the ocean like language, to hear a propeller's rhythm, the difference between whales and war. By 1941, the Atlantic had become the most dangerous battlefield on Earth. Hundreds of ships were lost each month, carrying food, munitions, and men. Britain was starving, rationing every ounce of grain and fuel. The battle was not about territory or prestige, it was about survival. And in that crucible, the Royal Navy's scientists and tacticians began to rethink how sound could be used not merely to find an enemy, but to fight him. Slowly, convoy doctrine evolved. Escorts no longer rushed toward a sonar contact in blind fury. Instead, they learned patience. They coordinated with one another through wireless and signal lamps, forming protective screens that acted like moving nets across the ocean. While one ship maintained sonar contact, another prepared to strike. Each success was studied, dissected, and turned into procedure. But a haunting problem remained. When a destroyer attacked with depth charges, it had to pass directly over the submarine's estimated position, which meant losing sonar contact at the most critical moment. The explosions, meant to kill, also deafened the water with noise and turbulence. If the U-boat survived the initial pattern, it could slip away unseen. This flaw, known as the blind period, would torment anti-submarine commanders until someone found a way to keep the sound alive during the attack itself, and that search for a weapon that could strike, while still hearing the target, a weapon that could make sound not just a sense but a killer, was already underway. By late 1941, the Royal Navy's escort commanders understood that their battle in the Atlantic was as much a contest of minds as machines. Every improvement the Allies made was met by a new German countermeasure. Donitz's wolf packs adapted swiftly, spreading wider, striking deeper, and learning to exploit the limits of British sonar. The night surface attack became their deadly art. U-boats could approach silently, fire torpedoes from periscope depth, then vanish into darkness before ASDIC could even find their echo. The British knew they needed more than courage. They needed new science. The first step came through organization. At the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, Admiral Sir Max Horton oversaw a revolution in convoy defense. Rather than scattered escorts reacting independently, he created escort groups, disciplined units trained to hunt cooperatively. Each destroyer and corvette had a defined role. One to maintain sonar contact, another to circle and attack, a third to screen against other U-boats nearby. This transformed chaos into choreography. Now, sound wasn't just detection. It was communication, coordination, and control. Yet the fundamental limitation remained. Depth charges were crude instruments. They had to be dropped behind the ship, leaving a fatal blind spot ahead. Each attack forced the sonar to break contact just when precision mattered most. Scientists at the Admiralty Research Laboratory began to ask a daring question. What if a ship could throw explosives forward, into the space where the sonar still had a target? The answer came in 1942, a compact forward-firing launcher called Hedgehog. It was deceptively simple. 24 small spigot mortars, arranged in a circular frame on the destroyer's bow. Each fired a 65-pound bomb in an arc ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, Hedgehog rounds didn't detonate automatically at set depths. They exploded only on contact with a submarine's hull. The sea stayed quiet unless the target was hit, which meant sonar operators could continue tracking right through the attack run. For the first time, sound and strike worked together. The weapon allowed a seamless transition from detection to destruction. Crews could hear the submarine as they fired, guiding each salvo with real-time feedback. The concept was revolutionary. No longer was the U-boat's greatest defense silence, its salvation. The ocean itself betrayed its position through echoes. As Hedgehog entered service, Britain's convoy escorts began integrating it into refined attack methods. The most famous was the creeping attack, a technique developed by Captain Frederick Johnny Walker, one of the Royal Navy's most innovative submarine hunters. In this tactic, one ship would maintain continuous sonar contact at low speed, relaying precise bearings to another ship creeping silently into position for the strike. The firing ship remained acoustically invisible until the very last moment, when the Hedgehog's projectiles arced into the water. Walker's groups demonstrated what the combination of discipline, patience, and sound-based weapons could achieve. His second support group would later become legendary, credited with sinking more U-boats than any other Allied formation. His men called the sonar the ear of God. The Germans called it something far darker, the sound of death. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Admiral Dönitz realized that the tide was shifting. Reports from U-boat crews spoke of attacks that seemed impossibly accurate, of ships that could follow them through evasive dives, hitting from angles once thought impossible. German scientists worked frantically on countermeasures. New coatings like alberic, made of synthetic rubber to absorb sonar waves, and acoustic decoys such as bold, small canisters that released bubbles to confuse sonar. These innovations bought time, but they could not hide forever. The Allies' sonar grew sharper, their tactics more relentless, and their conviction unbroken. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its critical point. U-boats still prowled in packs of 30 or more, coordinated by radio and guided by encrypted signals from France. Yet each attack now met a better-armed, better-trained enemy. Convoys that once scattered now held formation, defended by ships wielding radar, sonar, and forward-throwing weapons. The balance of power beneath the waves was shifting, not by numbers, but by sound. In the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a reckoning was coming. Soon, in the convoys of spring 1943, the hunters would become the hunted Hedgehog, and German crews would learn firsthand what it meant when Britain turned sound into a weapon. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a contest of steel and torpedoes. It was a contest of nerves, of endurance, and of listening. Every side heard the same ocean differently. For the Germans inside their submerged steel coffins, the ping of a British sonar pulse was a sound that crawled straight into the human soul. Inside a U-boat, silence was survival. When the hydrophone operator reported sonar pings, every man froze. No one spoke, no one coughed. Even the creak of a wrench or the whisper of air could mean discovery. The sonar ping was unlike any other sound in war. It was precise, mechanical, and unrelenting. It meant someone above was listening, probing, calculating. For the men trapped below, there was nowhere to run. They could only wait, sweating in the cold, counting the seconds between pulses, knowing each one brought the destroyer closer. Crews learned to read those sounds, the slow rhythm of distant searching, the sharper beat of a lock-on, and the dreadful silence that followed before the explosions. When Hedgehog arrived, that silence became something new. No warning depth charges, no thunder from above, just the sudden end of everything. Veterans later described it as the sea itself turning against us. By 1943, many U-boat crews believed the British had developed supernatural hearing. The psychological strain was immense. Some men refused to go below again after a close encounter. The enemy they feared most wasn't always human. It was the invisible, echoing voice of sound. For British escort groups, sound was both art and science. Every successful attack began not with sight, but with a faint echo. The sonar operator's headphones became a weapon as important as any gun. When a contact appeared, the entire crew shifted into a well-rehearsed routine. Engines slowed, men whispered, and the ship's movement became an extension of the echo bouncing beneath them. Training at the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, WWII, in Liverpool, transformed this process into doctrine. Officers studied mock battles on plotting tables, learning how to convert bearings and ranges into predictive movements. A single ASDIC contact could lead to a 2-hour chase, each maneuver based on how the sound changed. Destroyers and corvettes moved like dancers in a dark ocean, communicating silently through coded lights and hand signals. One ship maintained the fix, holding sonar contact without losing the echo, while another maneuvered for the kill. Success depended on teamwork and the ability to stay calm under crushing pressure. British tactics evolved toward patience rather than aggression. Instead of rushing in to drop charges, escort commanders learned to stalk slowly, tightening the circle. A premature attack meant losing the target forever. A measured approach could end it in one strike. Sound became not just detection but timing. The ocean itself was turned into a vast invisible map where a few skilled listeners could read the movements of an unseen enemy. ASDIC was both primitive and ingenious. It sent a short burst of sound, a pulse, through the water, then measured how long it took to return from a submerged object. The range was determined by time, the direction by the rotation of the transducer. Early sets had a maximum range of about 2,000 yards, but precision depended heavily on the operator's ear. The human element mattered. Two men could listen to the same echo and hear different things. Yet by 1942, the technology matured into a deadly tool. Improved models like the Type 144 and later 147B allowed continuous tracking, even during turns and maneuvers. They could discriminate between a submarine and ocean clutter, between rock and hull. These advances were paired with Hedgehog, which transformed the hunt. Instead of simply dropping explosives and hoping, the Hedgehog's pattern of bombs could be aimed where the sonar predicted the submarine's path. Because the bombs exploded only on contact, the sea stayed quiet. Operators knew instantly if they'd missed or struck true. In a sense, it was the first precision weapon of the underwater war. The sonar gave the range, the Hedgehog gave the reach, and together they allowed the hunter to hear and kill simultaneously. By early 1943, convoy escorts had grown confident. They no longer feared the wolf packs as before. Instead, they began to anticipate them, to listen for them. The British had transformed sound into strategy, and strategy into survival. But across the Atlantic, the Germans were learning to listen too. They would soon attempt to turn Britain's own weapon against her, to confuse, deceive, and silence the deadly ping. When British sonar began claiming U-boats faster than German shipyards could replace them, Dönitz turned to science. In secret laboratories scattered across the Reich, German engineers sought to twist sound itself into camouflage. Their first success came with the bold decoy, known among crews as the Pillenwerfer. It was a small canister, ejected through a launch tube, that released streams of gas bubbles into the water. These bubbles created a cloud of false echoes, confusing the British ASDIC and buying precious minutes to escape. For a time it worked. Destroyers would fix on the decoy's reflection and attack furiously, only to find empty sea. But the Allies adapted quickly. Operators learned to recognize the softer, fading echo of a decoy compared to the solid return of a submarine hull. In response, German research teams went further, developing anechoic coatings like alberic, layers of rubber tiles glued to the hulls of select U-boats. These absorbed sonar pulses rather than reflecting them, dramatically reducing their acoustic signature. Only a few submarines ever received this costly modification, but they demonstrated the principle that silence could be engineered. Even so, by 1943, these efforts could not keep pace with the sheer volume of Allied innovation. Each new trick was answered by a better ear. The ocean was turning into an acoustic chessboard, and Britain was several moves ahead. Behind every victory in the Atlantic stood leaders who understood that technology alone was meaningless without discipline. Admiral Sir Max Horton, commanding the Western approaches, forged an unbreakable doctrine of coordinated defense. He empowered his escort captains to act as independent hunters, small, agile task forces with the authority to pursue contacts beyond their assigned convoys. This decentralization of command created what he called support groups, ships that could reinforce convoys under attack or chase fleeing submarines for days. Horton's philosophy was simple. The sea is too wide for control, but not too wide for unity. Among his protégés was Captain Johnny Walker, the embodiment of sound warfare. Walker understood that the real weapon was not sonar itself, but the method of its use. His ships drilled endlessly in acoustic tactics, performing attack runs by ear in calm seas and in storms alike. He taught his men to trust what they heard, to move in rhythm with the sonar pulses, to be patient and relentless. Under his leadership, escort groups became predators. Walker's second support group alone destroyed more than 20 U-boats, a record that stunned the German command. Even when faced with exhaustion and loss, his crews remained obsessed with the hunt. To them, the ping of ASDIC was not fear. It was the sound of control, of survival. Across the sea, Admiral Karl Dönitz faced a grim reality. Once hailed as the architect of the wolf packs, he now watched his fleet suffer catastrophic losses. His own officers reported despair among the crews, whispers that the Allies could see through the ocean. Dönitz tried to restore morale, reminding his men that the U-boat is still the most dangerous weapon of the sea. But deep down, he knew the balance had shifted. Technology had stripped his submarines of their greatest strength: invisibility. Fighting beneath the ocean was unlike any other kind of warfare. There were no battlefields, no witnesses, no escape. When a submarine sank, it vanished forever into silence. For both sides, this created a strange kind of intimacy. The hunter and the hunted locked in a duel of sound, separated by only a few hundred feet of water and an invisible wall of fear. To British sailors, killing by sound was both empowering and haunting. They never saw the men they fought. There were no faces, no surrender flags, only the echo of steel and the hollow boom of underwater explosions. When the sea erupted in oil and debris, it was proof of victory. Yet many described an unease that followed. "You never saw them die," one officer later wrote. "But you knew you had ended 100 lives." For German submariners, the morality of silence became heavier with each patrol. They prided themselves on striking from the deep, unseen. Yet when the Allies began using sound to strike back, it felt like a violation of nature itself. Crews spoke of the sea losing its neutrality, of a world where even water betrayed them. There were no banners, no speeches, just endless tension and the unbearable ringing of sonar through the hull. By 1943, the human cost was staggering. More than 30,000 U-boat men, 3 out of every 4 who served, would never return. Many died without firing a torpedo. The Atlantic had become their grave. Yet out of this horror emerged a new truth of modern warfare, that the most powerful weapon was not always explosive, but information, the ability to sense, to predict, and to strike unseen. The stage was set for the defining confrontation of the undersea war. In the spring of 1943, as convoys crossed the storm-ridden mid-Atlantic, both sides would commit everything they had. The British had perfected their deadly symphony of sound, while the Germans launched their largest coordinated assault yet. What followed would decide the fate of the Atlantic, and, ultimately, the outcome of the war itself. The spring of 1943 opened with fury across the North Atlantic. Convoy routes were ice-choked, the weather brutal, and morale stretched thin on both sides. Yet beneath those cold, endless waves, the balance of the war was about to shift forever. The moment came with convoy ONS-5, 43 merchant ships sailing from Liverpool to Halifax, protected by 7 escorts. It was late April, the height of the U-boat campaign. Over 30 submarines, coordinated by Admiral Dönitz, were ordered to intercept. The convoy sailed straight into the jaws of the wolf pack. For the men aboard those ships, the Atlantic was a world of sound and darkness. At night, the horizon disappeared into rain and foam. Radar sweeps glowed faintly on bridge displays, while sonar operators in dim-lit rooms listened for the faintest echo. They knew the Germans were out there, somewhere beyond the static. On April 29th, a contact flickered into range. A sonar operator aboard the British destroyer HMS Duncan called out, "Contact, bearing 142, range 1,500 yards." A U-boat was moving in. Engines throttled down. Tension gripped the deck. The hunt had begun. The destroyers and corvettes of the escort group moved into formation, each ship playing its assigned role. Duncan's ASDIC team maintained contact, feeding constant bearings to HMS Vedette, which began creeping forward at low speed. The commander, Lieutenant Commander C.R. Pelly, followed the rhythm of the sonar pulses, aligning his ship precisely with the echo below. The sea was calm, but the air was thick with anticipation. Every man aboard could feel the moment tightening. Through the black water below, the German U-boat U-630 maneuvered desperately, descending deeper to escape detection. Its captain ordered silent running, cutting engines to a whisper. The crew held their breath as they listened to the distant ping of the British sonar. Each pulse echoed closer. They dropped decoys, bold canisters releasing streams of bubbles, but the British didn't bite. Pelly's operator adjusted the frequency, refined the range, and stayed locked on. The decoy drifted harmlessly aside. At 1,000 yards, Vedette's Hedgehog launchers were readied. The ship's bow rose slightly as her speed steadied at 5 knots. Pelly gave a quiet order. Fire. 24 spigot mortars launched in a perfect arc, raining down ahead of the ship in a deadly semicircle. The crew waited. 10 seconds passed. 15. Then, 4 near-simultaneous explosions. The ocean shuddered. A roar of cheers erupted from Vedette's deck. Sonar contact vanished in a burst of static. Moments later, a slick of oil and air bubbles rose to the surface. U-630 was gone, taking all 45 men with her. It was one of the first clear demonstrations of Hedgehog's precision. Unlike depth charges, it didn't waste explosives or mask sonar. Each hit meant a kill, and the operators could stay on target the entire time. Within hours, 2 more submarines were destroyed in similar attacks. For the Germans, the night had turned into chaos. Their radio network was jammed by Allied HF-DF direction finding, and radar-equipped aircraft from Iceland harassed them even on the surface. The wolf pack, once a symbol of terror, found itself disoriented and hunted. As the battle stretched into May, the weather worsened. Gale force winds battered ships and submarines alike. But the British escorts, hardened by months of experience, refused to yield. Captain Johnny Walker's 2nd Support Group, rushing to reinforce ONS-5, entered the fight like a pack of hounds. Walker's tactics, creeping attacks, sonar handoffs, and Hedgehog strikes turned sound into a weapon of absolute control. His flagship, HMS Starling, made contact with U-202 on May 5th. The submarine tried to dive beneath a temperature layer, hoping to hide in the acoustic shadow. But Walker's operator, trained to recognize the telltale fading of an echo through a thermocline, adjusted the sonar's angle manually. The contact snapped back into focus. Another Hedgehog attack followed. Moments later, an explosion tore through the deep. The U-boat never resurfaced. In just 5 days, convoy ONS-5 became a slaughterhouse. 11 U-boats were sunk. Only 1 British escort was lost. What was meant to be a decisive German ambush had turned into catastrophe. The survivors, who returned to their bases in France, described the experience as a nightmare, hunted by invisible weapons that struck without warning. The British had mastered the language of the sea, and for the first time Dönitz's wolf packs found themselves powerless. By May 6th, the battle was over. The convoy pressed westward, scarred but intact. The waters behind them were littered with oil slicks and debris. The men aboard the destroyers stood in silence, staring into the gray horizon, realizing they had witnessed the turning point of the Atlantic War. They didn't cheer this time, not out of coldness but respect. Each oil patch on the waves marked the end of a crew much like their own. And yet, deep beneath the waves, the war was far from finished. More U-boats prowled the routes ahead, and Dönitz still believed he could recover his advantage. But the British now held something the Germans could not match, a weapon that could hear as it killed. The ocean itself had chosen a side. The sinking of U-630 and the chaos of convoy ONS-5 sent shockwaves through the entire German command structure. Admiral Dönitz received the reports in disbelief. The Atlantic, once his hunting ground, was becoming a graveyard. Between April and May 1943, more than 40 U-boats were lost, a rate of destruction the Kriegsmarine had never imagined possible. The crews spoke of new Allied tactics, of ships that could track them without losing contact, of weapons that struck from silence. For the first time, Dönitz realized that the Allies had turned the sea's greatest mystery, sound, into their most devastating ally. In the days following ONS-5, the British continued their relentless offensive. Escort groups that had once been purely defensive now operated as mobile hunters. They no longer waited for attacks, they sought them. Using radar to find surfaced U-boats at night and sonar to chase them down by day, the Royal Navy transformed from prey into predator. The 2nd and 5th Support Groups, operating from Liverpool, coordinated across thousands of miles, guided by radio intelligence decrypted from Bletchley Park's Ultra Network. Each contact, each bearing, each sonar echo fit into a larger pattern of control. In late May, convoy SC-130 crossed the Atlantic under similar circumstances. 36 U-boats attempted to intercept. Not one reached its target. Allied aircraft, destroyers, and corvettes wove an unbroken web of detection. Radar from the skies, sonar from below, and HF-DF from distant stations. 3 U-boats were sunk, several more damaged, and the rest forced to retreat. Dönitz, whose strategy had always depended on massed attacks, now faced the reality that his wolf packs were being dismantled before they could even strike. Meanwhile, inside the U-boats, the psychological collapse deepened. The crews were exhausted, sleep-deprived, and terrified. The sonar ping, once a distant irritation, had become the drumbeat of death. Survivors of ONS-5 described moments of panic as the sound grew louder and sharper, until they could feel it reverberating through the metal hull like a heartbeat. It was as if the ocean itself was alive, one petty officer recalled years later, and it wanted us gone. Some crews attempted desperate countermeasures, diving deeper than safety allowed, risking implosion to escape detection. Others tried to surface under the cover of storms, only to be caught by aircraft equipped with radar and lee lights, powerful search beams that turned night into day. For the British, the victories came at a cost, but they knew the tide had turned. The operators who once sat in fear now listened with confidence. Every ping that returned from the deep was no longer a question. It was an answer. The precision of Hedgehog meant fewer wasted attacks and clearer results. Crews learned to recognize the hollow thunk of an impact beneath the water, followed by the delayed eruption of bubbles and debris. Each success confirmed that the weapon's concept worked flawlessly. By the end of May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. The month became known among German submariners as Black May. In just 30 days, the Kriegsmarine lost 41 U-boats, nearly 1/4 of its operational force. The Atlantic routes that had once bled Britain now ran with renewed life. Supplies, men, and munitions flowed freely again. The United States, now fully mobilized, added newer escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, and faster destroyers, tightening the noose even further. The U-boat threat, once existential, was finally being contained. At the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, the mood was grimly determined. Admiral Horton congratulated his officers but reminded them that the war beneath the waves was never finished. "We have not destroyed the enemy," he warned, "only driven him back." Yet privately, Horton and his analysts understood what Dönitz would soon have to admit. The age of the U-boat was over. For Dönitz, the realization was bitter. In early June, he ordered a withdrawal of his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively conceding the ocean to the Allies. He hoped to regroup, to field new technologies, faster boats, better torpedoes, improved stealth coatings, but it was too late. The Allies' advantage was no longer just material. It was intellectual. They could see, hear, and anticipate everything. The balance of power beneath the sea had been rewritten not by size or numbers, but by mastery of sound. The U-boat crews who returned to their bases in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire were met not with triumph, but with silence. They stepped ashore pale, hollow-eyed, and shaken. Some saluted. Some wept. Others simply stared at the sea that had turned against them. Their officers wrote in logs filled with terse, haunted entries. "Lost contact. ASDIC attack. No escape." For the men who had once stalked the ocean with confidence, the realization was unbearable. They were no longer the hunters. From that point forward, every convoy that crossed the Atlantic carried not only food and fuel but certainty. Britain had survived the storm. The destroyers that once fled now moved deliberately, their sonar pulses echoing across the depths like the beating heart of victory. The message was clear. The sea no longer belonged to silence. But as the convoys pressed westward and the oil slicks of shattered submarines drifted across the waves, the cost of this new era of warfare became evident. Thousands had died unseen, their last moments marked only by the faint echo of a ping. The war beneath the ocean had been won, but it was a victory earned in sound, shadows, and sorrow. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic was quieter. Convoys that had once lost half their number now crossed with minimal damage. The tables had turned completely. For the first time since the war began, the Allies were moving freely across the ocean. The reason was clear. They had learned to hear the enemy. The Battle of the Atlantic, long considered a desperate war of attrition, had transformed into a war of information. Sound, once invisible, intangible, had become the Allies' most decisive weapon. The numbers told the story. In March 1943, Allied merchant losses had reached a staggering 627,000 tons. Just 2 months later, after the introduction of Hedgehog-equipped escorts, improved radar, and refined sonar coordination, losses fell below 100,000 tons. At the same time, German U-boat casualties skyrocketed. More than 40 were destroyed in May alone. Dönitz, shaken by the scale of the disaster, ordered his submarines to withdraw temporarily from the North Atlantic to regroup. In reality, it was an admission of defeat, the first open acknowledgement that the wolf packs could no longer dominate the sea. The impact on morale was profound. For British and Canadian sailors, every successful convoy crossing felt like deliverance. The once haunting ping of sonar was no longer a warning of danger. It was a sound of control, a rhythm of hope. Escort commanders who had spent years on the defensive now sailed with confidence. Training centers at the Western Approach's tactical unit produced new generations of officers fluent in acoustic warfare. They drilled in sound laboratories, using recordings of submarine echoes, learning to distinguish between a true contact and the tricks of the ocean. Sound had become language, and the Allies were fluent in it. Meanwhile, the Germans fought to adapt. They deployed new torpedoes, such as the GNAT, German Navy acoustic torpedo, designed to home in on the propeller noises of escort ships. For a short time, it restored terror to the convoys. In September 1943, several Allied destroyers were struck by these seeking weapons. But once again, the British countered swiftly. They developed Foxer noisemakers, crude but effective devices towed behind ships, emitting a constant roar of bubbles and metallic clatter. These decoys lured the torpedoes harmlessly away. The cycle of measure and countermeasure continued, but the initiative had clearly passed to the Allies. On the surface, the tone of the war changed. Convoys now moved in near-perfect coordination with long-range air patrols, Liberators and Sunderlands sweeping vast sectors with radar, forcing U-boats to dive long before they could attack. What had once been a submarine's advantage, stealth and surprise, was now its weakness. Every dive risked detection by sonar. Every surface run risked radar exposure. The hunters had nowhere left to hide. At the Admiralty in London, analysts began to understand what had truly shifted the balance. It wasn't just the introduction of Hedgehog or better sonar hardware. It was the integration of knowledge, the linking of technology, intelligence, and human skill. From the physicists who refined transducer frequencies to the young operators who memorized the ocean's sounds, the victory was built on discipline and detail. The British had created a feedback loop between research and reality. Every battle produced data. Every loss produced learning. The ocean had become a vast classroom, and the Royal Navy was its most attentive student. In occupied Europe, Dönitz grew increasingly desperate. He ordered new models, the Type 21 electroboot, designed to stay submerged longer, faster, and quieter than any before. But production delays and bombing raids crippled the program. The U-boats that reached service came too late to alter the war's course. The Allies' mastery of detection had rewritten the rules of undersea combat. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic belonged to the Allies once more. The convoys rolled west in unbroken chains of steel, stretching beyond the horizon. Each merchant ship that reached port carried more than cargo. It carried proof that innovation, discipline, and sound had conquered fear. The wolf packs were scattered. Their silent reign had ended. Yet in the calm that followed, beneath the rhythm of sonar pulses and the hum of engines, there lingered an unspoken truth. The war had changed humanity's relationship with the sea forever. In the months that followed Black May, the transformation of the Atlantic War became irreversible. The once dreaded U-boats now fought merely to survive, and the Royal Navy turned from defense to dominance. Escort groups evolved into specialized hunter-killer units, trained to pursue and destroy submarines long after the convoys were safe. These operations marked a new phase, not a battle for survival, but for total control of the seas. From bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and Northern Ireland, Allied ships roamed vast sectors, guided by a web of intelligence unseen in earlier years. High-frequency direction finding, radar sweeps, and sonar contacts were plotted together on operations maps glowing with red and blue pins. The Western Approaches Command became a nerve center of acoustic warfare. Every contact report was logged, studied, and converted into training for the next encounter. The ocean was no longer an uncontrollable wilderness. It was being mapped, measured, and mastered through sound. At the heart of this new confidence was the synergy between science and seamanship. British research laboratories, particularly the Admiralty Signal and Radar Establishment and the Anti-Submarine Experimental Establishment, worked tirelessly to refine sonar precision. They developed stabilized transducers that maintained clear echoes even in rough seas, as well as variable depth sonar sets capable of piercing temperature layers that once hid submarines. The Royal Navy's escort crews became expert listeners, able to recognize subtle shifts in echo tone that revealed depth, angle, or motion. Every sonar operator, once a technician, had become an artist of detection. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to bleed. Even as Dönitz introduced new U-boats, the advanced Type WWII and the prototype Type WWII, the Allies' acoustic web closed tighter. Aircraft equipped with radar and sonobuoys extended detection range over thousands of miles. For the U-boat crews, the Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground but a killing field. Many never even saw their attackers. A single sonar contact relayed through the Allied network could bring aircraft, escorts, and support groups converging from all sides. The human toll was devastating. By 1944, over 25,000 German submariners had been lost at sea, a death rate higher than any other branch of the armed forces. In Germany, their portraits filled naval memorial halls, rows of young faces frozen in black and white. The Kriegsmarine, once proud and defiant, could only mourn. "We have fought against the mathematics of the ocean," one surviving captain wrote bitterly after the war. "And mathematics does not bleed." For the Allies, victory brought both relief and reflection. The techniques honed in the Atlantic soon spread worldwide, to the Mediterranean, the Arctic routes, and the Pacific. American, British, and Canadian navies shared technologies and tactics, standardizing sonar frequencies, weapon mounts, and convoy formations. Anti-submarine warfare had become an exact science. Yet the men who fought it rarely spoke of triumph. Many admitted that the ocean haunted them still, not for what they had seen, but for what they had heard. The eerie pings, the bubbling explosions, the fading echoes of dying ships. These sounds lingered long after the guns fell silent. In the shipyards and laboratories of Britain, the lessons of the Atlantic War shaped the future. The next generation of submarines would be built not just for stealth, but for silence, smoother hulls, quieter engines, and new materials to absorb sound. Sonar itself would become the foundation of post-war oceanography, underwater mapping, and Cold War surveillance. What began as a desperate defense against the U-boat evolved into one of humanity's most powerful tools for exploring the deep. But in 1943, as the last wreck settled on the seabed, none of that was yet visible. The men who fought in the Atlantic only knew that they had survived, that the sea, which once threatened to swallow them, had been turned to their advantage. Hedgehog projectors still lined the bows of corvettes and destroyers. Sonar operators still pressed their headphones close, listening for what might come next. The war at sea had proven something timeless, that even in darkness, knowledge can be a weapon, and that mastery of the unseen can decide the fate of nations. The Atlantic was quiet again, but its silence now belonged to those who had learned to command it. The Atlantic today is a place of calm horizons and endless blue, but beneath its surface lies a cemetery of steel, the resting place of thousands who fought a war no one could see. Between 1939 and 1945, over 3,500 Allied merchant ships and nearly 800 U-boats were lost. Each wreck tells a story of sound, of pings, echoes, and silence. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a struggle for control of shipping lanes. It was a turning point in how humanity understood war itself. For the first time, victory was achieved not by the might of guns or the weight of armor, but by the ability to listen. Britain's transformation of sound into a weapon was more than technological innovation. It was a triumph of adaptation. The men who once feared the dark depths learned to master them through discipline and science. They transformed the ocean from an enemy into an ally, proving that the invisible could be harnessed and controlled. Sonar, radar, and acoustic tactics redefined modern warfare. They made information the new artillery, precision, the new power. For the German U-boat crews, the ocean that once promised invincibility became a place of betrayal. Their faith in silence, in stealth, was undone by an enemy that had learned to hear. Many went to their graves never understanding how the British had done it, how the very water around them had become a conduit of their destruction. Yet their courage, like that of their enemies, remains part of the Atlantic's memory. In the years after the war, scientists who had built weapons of sound turned their tools toward exploration, mapping the ocean floor, studying marine life, and eventually listening for the heartbeat of the planet itself. What had once been the sound of death became the sound of discovery. The story of Britain's acoustic victory is not just about machines or battles. It is about perception, about how a nation under siege turned fear into knowledge, and knowledge into survival. The ping that once sent shivers down the spine of sailors became the pulse of human ingenuity. And in that rhythm, echoing still through the deep, lies the true legacy of how Britain turned sound into a weapon, and in doing so, reclaimed the sea.